We're now entering section 2 of Marketing Step by Step. In this section, we're going to dive deeper into marketing psychology. The next couple of sessions are really going to open your eyes and open your mind to the intricacies and the subtleties of how the human animal works, makes decisions, and ultimately decides to purchase things from you. This is session 3, Why We Think, Feel, and Behave the Way We Do. So as we've learned, human psychology isn't rational. From the inside, from our own perspective, it usually appears that our thinking, decisions, and actions are rational. But from the outside, it usually appears that our thinking, decisions, and actions are irrational. Humans do things for their reasons, not your reasons, and rarely are these reasons rational. Now we're going to learn about some interesting models that researchers and scientists have created to really understand the irrational human being. And you're going to hear me use the term the human chimpanzee in this program a lot, because we really, in most of our behaviors, most of our thinking, our emotional responses, we essentially act like an overgrown, highly intelligent chimpanzee. Jared Diamond, who created the Pulitzer Prize-winning Guns, Germs, and Steel book and then documentary, he wrote a book before he wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel called The Third Chimpanzee. And in this book, he said there are basically 3 different chimpanzees. There's the chimpanzee, the bonobo, which some people call the pygmy chimp, which looks a lot like a chimp but has many behavioral differences, and then the human. And that we all diverged from a common ancestor several million years ago, and we have a lot more in common than we think. Now, what has become fashionable to do is to look at the aspects of our behavior that we don't like our violence and our political motivations and our backstabbing and our selfishness, and we say, oh yeah, well that's our evolutionary past. That's the animal that's inside of us. That's the bonobo, and that's the chimp, and that's the mammal. But what we don't realize is that all of the things that we love and that we treasure about being human, things like warmth, generosity, reciprocity, taking care of family, having motivation to achieve things, that this is also all rooted in our animal past, and we have these things in common with the other 2 types of chimpanzee as well. Now, our particularly intelligent minds, which of course have other mechanisms in them that the other types of chimpanzees don't, one of its real interesting powers is the power to confabulate and make our thinking and decisions and actions appear rational. But if you just step outside for a second and you look at other human beings and the way they behave, you'll see that there's something other than cold, logical rationality going on. So again, our psychology is rooted in our past. Great progress has been made decoding human psychology and behavior over the past decades. And the more we look for, quote-unquote, evolutionary drivers of our psychological mechanisms, the more we find them. If you look behind most thoughts, feelings, and actions, you'll find survival, reproduction, and status. There's a game-changing field that's been emerging and really coming on the public consciousness scene in the last couple of decades, and it's called evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology. Now, wherever you are, whatever your belief system, however you like to look at the world and who we are and where we come from, most fields most areas of thought, whether they be scientific, practical, religious, spiritual, are all incorporating some aspects of evolution into their models because of the overwhelming evidence that we're seeing. And we're making it fit into all of our different models as well. But behind the success in evolution, what we find is that the common denominators, especially for humans, are survival, reproduction, and social status. So survival, sex, and status. And as Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner, the self-made billionaire, likes to say, whenever he looks hard enough behind human behavior that doesn't make any sense to him, okay, he finds incentives. He finds something going on to explain it, something that's driving the humans. Now, it doesn't look like it at first, but the more you study, the more you see that there are these common denominators. The evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary biologists and behaviorists, as they've looked closer, they realize that so much is related to sex and reproduction that it's really startling. In fact, one of them I was reading has a rule of thumb. Whenever they look at something in animal bodies or displays or behavior that doesn't make any sense, like giant antlers on an elk that require a tremendous amount of calories and work to grow, or long feathers on the tail of a peacock that make it very susceptible to being caught by predators that are very hard to grow and to take care of, all the way to bright coloring and different types of dances that make you very visible to predators. When they look at anything that just doesn't make sense, they start to look to sexuality and reproduction, and then it starts to make sense. And what's usually going on is that particular thing was attractive to members of the opposite sex, and so it got a little bit exaggerated, and the little bit longer peacock feather that was attractive to the female peacocks got longer and longer and longer. And now you've got peacocks with these long 4, 5, 6 foot long feathers that make these incredible, mind-blowing displays, all as a result of evolution. Now, kind of a layer that runs over survival and reproduction is this thing called social status. And the more we look at the human animal and the human chimp, the more we find underneath it a very political, status-oriented animal. And for good reason. Being status-oriented, in other words, liking to know where we fit in the social hierarchy, was very good for pack cohesion. It kept the group together. It made sure that they behaved in a way that allowed them to succeed as a group. And because we most likely evolved in groups of 100 to 150, where we knew everyone in our group and we knew where we stood in the group, and we got a lot of our security from our status within the group, we evolved over long periods of time to really become oriented towards status. Now, social status is really getting a bad rap right now in kind of the postmodern age, where very idealistic mindsets are showing up and saying we should no longer organize into status hierarchies because that's animal stuff and that's not right and it's not good. Well, that at its kind of highest evolution may be true, but it turns out that no matter what you do, we humans organize ourselves into status hierarchies, whether we're with one person or 10 people or 1,000 people, and there doesn't really appear to be anything that we can do about it. And saying it's wrong and bad and trying to pretend it doesn't exist, from my experience, just makes us act kind of crazy and act like we're not in touch with reality. It doesn't actually make it go away. Now, I think we can transcend this status drive and make it something that's part of a healthy growth, a healthy group, where it doesn't marginalize and oppress others, and where it really is based on healthy development. But the point for this program, without going into too much depth, is that behind most thoughts, feelings, and actions, you will find survival, reproduction, and status, the drive to get these things, the drive to avoid losing them. We humans have three brains in one. Three brains in one. Our brain appears to be three different brains in one. A scientist, Dr. Paul MacLean, created a model that he calls the triune brain. Triune brain. And in the triune brain, we have an old reptilian brain, that's the little ball at the top of our spinal cord, kind of the back of the brain, the brainstem there. Around that grew what's called the mammal or the emotional brain. And then around that grew the cortex or the thinking brain. So inside of us, we have a reptile, a mammal, and a thinker. The challenge is that our three brains aren't very well integrated, and the older brains seem to rule the newer. So whereas we walk around thinking that it's our logical brain that's in control, it's usually our emotional brain, and in many cases it's our reptilian brain. Now it turns out that the reptilian, the mammal, and the thinking brain also correspond to the physical, emotional, and rational or mental realities or worlds. First grew the reptilian brain to interact with the physical world, to eat, to reproduce, to survive. Then grew the mammal or the emotional brain, which allowed us to bond with others and group together into herds and flocks and so forth, and care for our young and raise them to adulthood. And this we share with other mammals. And then on top of that grew the thinking brain. And this allowed us to reflect on ourselves, to have awareness of awareness, and to use symbols and concepts, and to create logic, to predict, to use the past, to use the future, to communicate with ourselves and others. Three different levels, three brains, three different realms that we live in: the physical, the emotional, and the logical. But these three brains don't seem to communicate very well with each other, even though they're organized and running as one. And so what happens is when the reptilian brain gets triggered, in other words, when we're facing a situation that we perceive to be dangerous, we feel a lot of fear, or there's a mating opportunity in front of us, we go right back into this fight or flight brain and we begin behaving like an animal. Or many folks, being really centered in the mammalian brain, are so concerned with what other people think of them, with trying to get approval, with loving the other people around them, they don't use their logical minds to make rational decisions that can help them get ahead in a complex information environment. Most people spend most of their time living in their reptile and their mammal. The real bottom line here is that we humans are built and wired for a time that doesn't exist anymore. We humans are built and wired for a time that doesn't exist. The modern environment has changed dramatically from our original environment. We have become Homo technologists living inside the self-built human zoo. But don't forget, our wiring hasn't changed. We evolved in environments where we were out in the open. We eventually started living in places like caves and probably trees and things, but essentially we did not have modern apartment buildings and dwellings where we could close and lock the door. We live in a very different environment. We're not in nature anymore. Desmond Morris wrote a book called The Human Zoo. He also wrote an interesting book called The Naked Ape, where he analyzed humans as just another ape, and guess what? We tend to behave most of the time just like other apes. Well, he wrote another book called The Human Zoo, where he suggested that when you take animals and you put them inside of a zoo, they stop behaving like themselves because they don't have their environment. They become apathetic and depressed and lethargic, and they just lay around all day. Well, turns out that we humans do the same thing, only we've built our own zoo, and we call it homes and towns and cities, and we go in and lock ourselves in every night. And then when we start getting depressed and apathetic and lethargic and fat and, unhappy and diseased, we say, wow, there's something really wrong. But we never tie it back to the fact that we have now put ourselves inside the human zoo, but we have the wiring for living outside, out in the real world. Very important to remember. This all leads to the reality that we don't make decisions logically. We make decisions unconsciously, and we make them with our animal. The process of making a decision appears to be rational, again, from the inside, so we assume that it is. It now appears that most decisions aren't made consciously. Instead, decisions are made on an unconscious level, then rationalized with the conscious mind, as we've learned. And to make things worse, we are completely overwhelmed by communications and choices. As Al Ries and Jack Trout said in the book Positioning, we live in the world's first over-communicated society. They said that, by the way, in 1980. Okay, so let that roll around in your head for a moment. The level of choice we have is literally immobilizing us, and the average person has essentially no hope of silencing the increasing noise. We are dramatically over-communicated. We're inundated with communication, distraction. The choices we have are immobilizing us. It's gone beyond having just a few choices. Now we're immobilized by choice. There are just too many of them. And the average person has essentially no hope of silencing the increasing noise that's coming in because they don't consciously realize what's happening. They don't understand that all of their time, effort, and attention is being taken by machines, by the internet, by others. And so they're overwhelmed, and this is becoming their regular reality. It's what they are now accustomed to. Another important psychological insight to succeed in marketing is that we humans are twice as motivated to avoid pain as we are to get pleasure. So many different tests have shown that we humans will pay twice as much to avoid pain as we will to get pleasure. The problem or fear or pain aspect of what you sell is likely twice as important as the pleasure aspect. So why would this be? Why would we humans be twice as motivated to avoid pain as we are to get pleasure? Well, the simple explanation is probably that in the environments that we evolved in, if something bad happened, it was game over. Okay, if we didn't escape from the saber-toothed tiger that was after us, we died. Okay, if we didn't reproduce, our genes didn't make it to the next generation. So we are very motivated to avoid what you might call loss or pain or problems or failure. And again, it seems that we're about twice as motivated, according to the experiments, as we are to get our desire or our pleasure. Now, this doesn't mean that pleasure and desire don't motivate us, because they do. It just means that avoiding pain and problems and fears and anxiety and worry is twice as motivating as getting our want, our desire, or our pleasure. Now, this is important to really, really take in, really absorb, because when creating marketing, my experience is that most inexperienced marketers will try to sell benefits that are positive, try to sell the pleasure, try to sell the good, rather than selling what their product or service will help you avoid, the fear that it will get rid of, the problems that it will solve, the pain that it will make go away. Also, a lot of people in this day and age tend to not want to pay attention to the negative. They're focused on positive thinking, and they say, well, I'm just going to think about the positive. I'm not going to think about any of that bad stuff. Well, this leads to, of course, avoiding even looking at the pain, which makes it usually get worse. And when we avoid looking at things and they get worse, then we get into a cycle of avoidance, of repression, etc., and it can just really be a big challenge. So remember, we're twice as motivated to avoid pain as we are to get pleasure, And we need to use this in our marketing and use this when communicating with customers and getting customers for our business. When we have a need, our entire thinking and deciding process changes. A person who is experiencing a need, a craving, a desire, a fear becomes a different animal, so to speak. When under the influence of a need, we become single-minded in our quest to satisfy it. So a general rule of thumb here is the stronger the need, the more we behave like a mindless animal. And if the need gets so strong that it actually pushes the button of survival or reproduction or status, and we see the opportunity to gain or assure survival, reproduction status, or to not lose it, we will act in desperation. The point here is that when a human being goes from the state of no need to the state of need, the way our minds and our emotions and our bodies work also changes. For example, think about when you've had a really satisfying meal that you really like, and you ate it, you really enjoyed it. An hour later, you're feeling fat, happy, and satisfied. Okay? In relationship to food, what's your thinking? What's your feeling? What's your behavior? Well, when you've just eaten and you're satisfied, you're probably optimistic that you're going to get more food in the future. You're probably thinking, yeah, I feel really happy and healthy right now. I'm going to eat more healthy food in the future. I'm going to take care of myself. I really feel good right now. Well, contrast that with a time in your life, maybe you can remember, where you didn't have anything to eat all day. And maybe you woke up and literally didn't get anything to eat for the entire day, and now it's the evening time. Maybe you got really busy, or you were out traveling somewhere, or you got stranded somewhere and you couldn't have anything to eat. Now think about how you feel about food and your relationship to it. When you're really hungry, all of the thoughts of logic and strategic long-term thinking and health, they fly out the window. And all that comes in is, I want yummy food now. And in fact, this is probably one of the reasons why we eat so much junk food, is because we wait until we get hungry before we choose what we're going to eat. And it turns out eating and survival are very closely related, and have been for quite a while, as far as I can tell. So this pushes this survival button inside of us when it gets too strong, and then we stop behaving like a rational human and we start behaving like a hungry animal, and we'll do anything to get food. Humans also tend to get very irritable and, frankly, more animal-like when they're hungry. I know I do. Another important point is that we humans are very bad at figuring out how much things are worth. Money, value, and prices are very confusing to humans. We are constantly looking for cues, criteria, and comparisons to understand how much products and services are worth. The invention of money was a beautiful moment in our evolution as humans, but it was also a very challenging moment. When we created money, it allowed us to exchange one thing for another very quickly, very easily. If you had a goat and you wanted to trade it for 2 axes and a fishing net, well, that might have been very complex a few thousand years ago before we had money, because you'd have to find people with different types of things and do multiple different trades. It was very unlikely that you were going to find someone that had exactly what you wanted in exchange for your goat. But when we invented money, you could sell your goat to someone who wanted it for money and then go take the money and trade it for the axes and the net that you wanted, and everything happened very smoothly. Well, over time, money changed from gold, it changed from shells, it changed from grain and other material things that represented the value to coins and to bills. Okay, and that little leap screwed a lot of people up because they couldn't think about it anymore in terms of what you could do with it. Now it became more abstract. Then it became numbers on a screen. or things you look at inside of a computer screen. Now it's very, very abstract, and most humans just can't even deal with it. And then when they hear that the value of our currency is going up and down in relationship to other currencies, and we have nothing that backs our currency anymore other than IOUs, we just close our eyes and shake our heads and say, I can't even deal with that. So we humans, number one, we think that money is value. Number two, we don't know how to compare the value of things to each other because all we can think of is how much money is it worth. And three, when we get confused, we just kind of shut down. We put our head in the sand and we say, I don't want to think about it anymore. And all of this adds up to prospective customers who need clarity. Okay, prospective customers who need clarity. You cannot hope to cut through this inner and outer noise without focus. You must know what you're offering, who it's for, what the benefit is to them, then present it to the irrational human mind, the irrational human chimp. If you don't do this, you might as well not even start because, again, you're dealing with too many layers of challenge. The irrational human mind, the confusion around value and money, the inability to focus because we have too many distractions and interruptions, the fact that we live in an environment that's so alien to the one we evolved in that's screwing us up in other ways. You're dealing with human beings, potential customers, who need some clarity. And unless you are focused, unless you understand this and you understand what you're offering, you understand who you're talking to, where to find them, what the benefits are, how you're going to help them avoid pain, and then understand how to present it to the irrational part of the human mind. Because again, if you've done your job as a business person and a marketer, you're finding people who are in need. You're not just trying to sell what you offer to random people. You're talking to people who are in need. So again, they're in a different frame of mind. So you got to present it to this irrational human mind in a way that makes sense to them, that allows them to buy, to enjoy consuming, to make a good decision and feel good about it. And if you don't, you might as well not even start. So let's do an exercise now, appealing to the irrational human. Appealing to the irrational human. Humans are irrational, and most of our decisions, communication, and behavior are the result of irrational forces driving us. To succeed in marketing, you must abandon logic and begin considering and appealing to the irrational motives and drivers hiding in the shadows of human psychology. So take a few minutes now and answer these questions. First, where have you expected people to buy your products because it was the logical choice or the logical thing to do? When have you believed that if you offered a better product, people would buy it? Again, better being logical. So when have you believed that if you offered a better product, people would buy it? When have you believed that if offered a better product, people would buy it? And then finally, how can you begin appealing to the irrational motivations that are really driving most of human thought, communication, and behavior? How can you begin appealing to the irrational motivations that are really driving most human thought, communication, and behavior? Answer these questions now, and I will see you in the next session of Marketing Step by Step.